Six black siblings vanished with their adoptive parents in 1989. 11 years later, one was found alive. In 1989, a white couple adopted six black brothers and vanished into the Oregon woods to start a new world. The state called it a success story. The truth was an 11-year nightmare of systematic terror that no one knew was happening. A secret that would only be broken by a desperate message from a boy who had already been erased. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The air in the sterile meeting room of the Multnomah County Social Services building felt heavy, thick with the unspoken grief that clung to the six Washington brothers like a second skin. It was the summer of 1989, a season that was supposed to be about freedom and sunlight, but for them, it was a listless limbo. Their parents, taken in a sudden, senseless car accident 4 months prior, had left a silence so vast it had its own gravity, pulling everything inward. Elijah, at 16, felt the weight of that gravity most. He was the eldest, the de facto guardian, a role he hadn't asked for but shouldered with a grim maturity that sat uneasily on his young frame. He watched his brothers now, a scattered constellation of loss. Marcus, 14, was trying to project an aura of teenage indifference, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. David, 12, was sketching furiously in a worn notebook, his pencil strokes the only voice he seemed to have left. 10-year-old Jeremiah, JJ, was humming a cartoon theme song, a small, repetitive act of normalcy in a world that was anything but. And then there were the little ones. Leon, 8, his thumb permanently lodged in his mouth, and Caleb, the baby at 6, whose wide, innocent eyes still searched every new face for the two that would never return. They were a unit, bound by blood and tragedy. Elijah's singular focus had been keeping them together. The foster system was a meat grinder, notorious for scattering sibling groups to the four winds. He'd fought, pleaded, and promised to be the adult in the room, and for a few months, it had worked. They'd stayed in a temporary group home, a chaotic but united front. Now, that was about to change. Across the table sat Michael and Sarah Bishop. To the system, they were a miracle. A white couple from a rural part of Oregon, willing, no eager, to adopt an entire sibling group of 6 black boys. On paper, they were perfect. No criminal record, stable finances from a well-documented inheritance, and a stated desire to provide a wholesome, self-sufficient life, far from the city's corruption. But as Elijah watched them, a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. It wasn't just that they were white, it was their stillness. They sat with ramrod-straight posture, their hands folded placidly on the table. Michael Bishop had a thin, ascetic face, with pale eyes that seemed to look right through you, assessing your worthiness. He spoke in calm, measured tones about discipline, purity, and the character-building virtues of hard labor. Sarah, his wife, was even more unsettling. She smiled, but it was a brittle, practiced thing that never reached her eyes. Her gaze was intense, analytical, sweeping over the 6 of them, not with warmth, but with the detached scrutiny of a collector examining potential acquisitions. Maria Vance, their social worker, felt it too. She was young, barely 5 years into the job, and still carried a fierce, almost naive idealism. She'd championed the Washington brothers, her heart aching for their loss and her spirit buoyed by Elijah's fierce loyalty. When the bishop's application came in, she felt a surge of professional triumph. But the home visit had been strange. Their house, an hour outside the city, was sparsely furnished, almost unervingly clean, with shelves of books on agriculture, theology, and survivalism. They spoke of their plan to move further out, to a large plot of land they owned deep in the forest, to build a new life, a sanctuary. "We believe children need structure, a firm hand," Michael had said, his pale eyes fixed on Maria. "The world has grown soft, decadent. We intend to forge them into strong, resilient men." The words themselves weren't necessarily red flags, but the feeling behind them, a cold, ideological fervor, had made the hairs on Maria's arms stand up. She had noted her reservations, her deep sense of unease in the file, but her superiors, overwhelmed with caseloads and desperate for a placement, saw only a solution. 6 boys, 1 home. A success story. The adoption was approved. Now, in this final meeting, the dread was a living thing in the room. "We are so blessed," Sarah Bishop said, her smile not touching the cold fire in her eyes as she looked at the boys. "To be able to give these young men a new family. A pure beginning." Elijah met her gaze and felt a profound, instinctual rejection. He saw no love there, only purpose. He leaned forward. "Where exactly are we going?" he asked, his voice clear and steady. Michael Bishop answered, "To a place where you can be unmade and remade, where the noise of the world can't touch you. It is a gift, Elijah." The words sounded like a threat. "I don't think," Elijah began, looking at Maria, a desperate plea in his eyes. "Do something. You see this too. This isn't right." But it was too late. The papers were signed. The system had washed its hands of them. Maria Vance gave him a helpless, heartbroken look, her own professional duty forcing her to betray her gut. 2 hours later, they were gone. The 6 Washington brothers, with all their worldly possessions packed into a few black trash bags, were loaded into the back of a large passenger van. Michael drove, Sarah sat beside him, and the metal door slid shut, plunging the boys into a stuffy, gasoline-scented darkness as they pulled away from the curb. Caleb started to cry, a thin, frightened wail. Leon, beside him, began to tremble. Elijah pulled them close, wrapping his arms around them, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "It's okay," he whispered into the darkness, his voice rough. "It's gonna be okay. I'm right here." But as the van rumbled onto the highway, leaving the familiar sounds of Portland behind, he watched the thin slivers of city light visible through the tinted windows fade away, replaced by an unbroken, oppressive black. The van turned onto a rougher road, the asphalt giving way to gravel, the jostling becoming more violent. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had failed. He hadn't kept them safe. He had delivered them into the hands of the smiling monsters. The long, silent nightmare had just begun. The first letter Maria Vance sent, a standard 6-week follow-up, received a reply 2 weeks later. The envelope, addressed in a severe, blocky script, contained a single page. The letter, supposedly from Elijah, was short and stilted. It spoke of hard work, fresh air, and learning the value of discipline. It mentioned that the family was very busy building their new life and that regular mail would be difficult. There was no warmth, no news of the other boys, no echo of the fierce, protective teenager she remembered. It felt wrong, like a letter written with a gun to the head. Maria reread it a dozen times, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She showed it to her supervisor, George, whose optimism had been eroded by decades of bureaucratic attrition. "It's a bit cold, sure," George conceded, handing it back. But he replied, "They're settling in. These things take time, Maria. Give them space." Against her better judgment, she waited. 2 months later, she sent another letter, this one filled with questions about school and how the younger boys were adjusting. The reply took a month. This time, the handwriting was subtly different, the block letters even more rigid. "We are well. The work is purifying. Do not trouble us with worldly concerns." It was signed the Bishop family. That was the moment her anxiety turned to ice-cold dread. Elijah would never write that. He would never call himself a bishop. The boys had been silenced, their voices replaced by this cold, monolithic entity. Fueled by a growing panic, Maria did what she was not supposed to do. She started her own investigation. Her next stop was the local sheriff's office. The deputy on duty was a young man with a chip on his shoulder, his uniform a size too big. Maria explained the situation, her voice tight with urgency. She laid out the bare facts. 6 adopted boys, a radical couple who talked about purification, and a complete, deliberate severing of all contact. The deputy listened with a placid, dismissive air. He took down the names, tapping them into an ancient computer system. "Well, ma'am," he said, leaning back in his squeaking chair, ran the names. Michael and Sarah Bishop. No wants, no warrants. Clean. As for the kids, the adoption is legal. They moved. There's no crime here. But it's their behavior. Maria insisted, her voice rising. Their ideology. They seemed unstable. Don't you have a duty to perform a wellness check? The deputy gave her a look that was part pity, part contempt. A wellness check? On who? At where? You got an address? Deep in the woods ain't a location, ma'am. That's half the state. Look, no offense, but it sounds like a classic case of city folk getting spooked by country folk. He then offered the insidious excuse that would haunt Maria for years. Besides, I see this all the time. Troubled kids from the city, probably a handful. Maybe the parents just needed to get him away from their old friends, gangs, that sort of thing. Give him a clean slate. The implication was clear. The boys themselves were the problem. Maria felt a surge of powerless rage. They are not troubled kids. They're children who lost their parents. They're good boys. Right? The deputy said, turning back to his screen. He gave a final, placating sigh. Look, ma'am, I've filed your report. But without a physical address, there's not much we can do. If we get another call, or if one of my guys happens to be out in that corner of the county, I'll have him keep an eye out. The tone made it clear the conversation was over, and the report was already forgotten. Maria Vance made one last, desperate call to the state police, escalating her concerns. She spoke to a detective, a man whose voice was thick with cynicism. Look, Ms. Vance, he'd said, his tone weary. I get it. You care. But my hands are tied. They haven't broken any laws. The adoption is ironclad. We can't launch a multi-county manhunt for a family that's chosen to live off the grid. The file is closed. The click of the phone hanging up was the loudest sound Maria had ever heard. It was the sound of a door slamming shut, of a system failing, of 6 boys being utterly and completely abandoned. The lie that they were a loving family who had simply moved was now the official story. The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time, Maria truly understood. No one was coming to help. She was alone with their ghosts. The passage of time in the bishop's compound was not marked by holidays or birthdays, but by the turning of seasons and the slow, grinding erosion of hope. The 11 years between 1989 and 2000 were a long, monotonous nightmare, punctuated by moments of stark, unforgettable horror. This was the world of the culling. The bishop's philosophy was a twisted form of social Darwinism married to a fanatical, self-made theology. They believed they were not raising sons, but forging tools for a new world that would rise from the ashes of the old. Only the strongest, most obedient, and purest of the brothers were worthy. Weakness, whether of body, spirit, or will, was a contamination that had to be purged. For the first few years, Elijah fought to keep his brothers' spirits alive. He was their secret historian, their keeper of memories. During the grueling days of labor, he would whisper stories of their parents, of their life in Portland, of the taste of pizza and the sound of Saturday morning cartoons. At night, in the cold, dark barracks, he would hold secret lessons, teaching the younger ones to read and write using a charred stick on the rough wooden floor. He knew that their mind were the one thing the bishops couldn't completely chain. His most important act of rebellion was his chronicle. It wasn't a single notebook he had managed to steal. It was a testament scavenged from trash and ruin. The journal was an old, water-damaged accounting ledger he'd found buried in the dirt floor of a collapsed woodshed. He kept a small pencil stub, sharpening it meticulously with a sharp stone. He found a loose floorboard beneath his own bunk in the corner of the barracks they all shared. He wrapped the ledger in a sheet of discarded plastic he'd found, protecting it from the damp earth below. In stolen moments of twilight, his heart hammering in his chest, he would slip the ledger out to become a meticulous journalist of their damnation. He documented every rule, every punishment, every chilling sermon, and the slow, creeping decline of his brothers. The first to be culled was Leon. It happened 3 years in. Leon, who was 11 by then, had always been frail. A deep, wet cough settled into his chest during a particularly harsh winter. In the city, it would have been a trip to the doctor, a course of antibiotics. At the compound, it was a test of faith. Sarah Bishop declared it a spiritual impurity and prescribed a regimen of fasting and prayer. They moved him to a small, unheated shed to isolate the sickness from the pure. Elijah and the other brothers would sneak him scraps of food and blankets, their hearts breaking as they listened to his ragged breathing through the thin walls. One morning, the breathing stopped. Michael Bishop gathered the remaining 5 brothers by the shed. Leon was weak, he announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. The world that is coming has no place for weakness. He's been returned to the earth. Do not mourn him. Learn from him. They buried him in an unmarked hole at the edge of the forest. There was no marker, no prayer. He was simply gone. Elijah wrote it all down in his journal that night, his hand shaking with a rage so profound it felt like it would split him in two. They killed him. They called it a test, but they murdered my brother. 2 years later, it was Marcus. At 19, Marcus's teenage rebellion, long suppressed, finally boiled over. He was strong, and he started to talk back, to question Michael's authority. The final confrontation came when Michael struck JJ for a minor infraction. Marcus stepped between them. "Leave him alone," he snarled. The punishment was swift and brutal. Michael and Sarah called it the trial of will. They chained Marcus to a tree at the center of the compound, with no food and only a small cup of water each day. They wanted him to break, to beg for forgiveness. For 3 days, he held out his defiance, a burning flame. On the 4th day, a terrible storm rolled in, lashing the compound with freezing rain. The other brothers, locked in their barracks, could hear his weakening cries for help. By morning, he was silent. Hypothermia, they later learned. Michael called it a failure to overcome. Elijah recorded the truth. They left him to die. He stood up for JJ, and they executed him for it. The compound became a place of quiet, terrified obedience. The remaining brothers, Elijah, David, JJ, and Caleb, learned to become invisible. They worked without complaint, their faces blank masks. David stopped sketching altogether. JJ, once a bundle of energy, became sullen and withdrawn. Only Elijah kept the fire burning inside, his journal his only confidant. The trial for David came a month later. He was accused of stealing food, an apple he had given to a starving Caleb. His punishment was to dig a new irrigation ditch, a task that would take weeks on half rations. Weakened and exhausted, he collapsed one afternoon from heat stroke. The bishops left him where he fell. They said God would judge if he was worthy to rise. Elijah wrote, his tears smearing the pencil lead. He never got up. Now, there were 3. Elijah, JJ, and Caleb. JJ was next. At 19, he made a desperate attempt to escape. He was fast, and he almost made it to the old logging road before Michael, a skill tracker, caught him. They didn't chain JJ. His punishment was psychological. They locked him in a root cellar, a dark, damp hole in the ground, for a month. When he emerged, he was a broken shell of a boy, his mind fractured. He wandered the compound, muttering to himself, and a few months later, walked into the forest and never returned. The bishops didn't even look for him. He chose the wilderness, Sarah declared. The unworthy have purged themselves. By the dawn of the year 2000, only 2 remained, Elijah, now 27, and Caleb, 17. The years of suffering had honed Elijah into a man of quiet, cold fury. His entire existence was now dedicated to 2 goals: keeping Caleb alive and preserving the truth in his journal. The end was triggered not by a grand escape plan, but by a cough. During the damp, cold start of the year, Caleb developed a deep, rattling sickness in his chest, identical to the one that had claimed Leon over a decade earlier. Elijah watched in horror as the bishops began the same chilling ritual. They spoke of spiritual impurity. Sarah prescribed fasting and prayer, her eyes holding the same detached, analytical gaze she had fixed on Leon. Elijah knew it wasn't a test. It was a death sentence. He saw his baby brother, the last one, fading before his eyes. The bishops were not going to treat the illness. They were going to watch it consume him as a final lesson in purity. The thought of writing Caleb's name into the ledger next to the others broke something inside him. That evening, he confronted Michael, who was sharpening an axe by the light of a lantern. There was no shouting, no explosive rage, just the cold, unbreakable calm of a man with nothing left to lose. "He needs a doctor," Elijah said, his voice level. Michael stopped his work, looking up. "He needs faith. The weakness must be purged." "I watched you purge Leon," Elijah said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more weight than any scream. "I will not watch you do it to him." The argument that followed was the first and last time Elijah challenged Michael's authority directly. It was a clash not of fists, but of wills, ending only when Sarah emerged from the main cabin. Seeing the defiance in Elijah's eyes, the one thing they could never break, she gave Michael a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. It was then that Michael, in a clumsy, panicked act of violence, raised a heavy iron skillet from the fire pit and struck Elijah in the head. Caleb saw it all from his hiding spot in the woods. He saw his last brother, his protector, fall. He saw the bishops drag Elijah's body into the forest. He heard them talking, their voices sharp with alarm. "It was messy," Sarah said. "We have to leave. Now, we'll take the boy and go to the secondary location." They left Elijah in a shallow grave and returned to the cabin to pack. Caleb, paralyzed by terror and a grief so profound it stole the air from his lungs, was utterly, completely alone. His entire family, his entire world had been murdered around him, one by one. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that he was next. Summer bled into autumn in the Oregon woods. The bishops, agitated and paranoid after Elijah's murder, were accelerating their plans to abandon the compound. They spoke of a final purification in a new sanctuary, words that made Caleb's blood run cold. His chance came on a crisp October morning. The bishops left Caleb, chained by his ankle, to an iron bed frame while they made a final supply run. But this time, they made a mistake. The shackle was old and rusted. Caleb, fueled by a surge of desperate adrenaline, twisted and pulled, his ankle raw and bleeding, until a corroded link in the chain finally snapped. He was free, but the forest that surrounded him was a massive, green prison. He knew he couldn't outrun them. His only hope was to leave a message, a testament, a final scream into the void. He remembered an old, abandoned hunting cabin he'd seen once on the far edge of the property, near a trail they never used. He ran, his lungs burning, his bare feet slapping against the cold, damp earth. He stumbled into the clearing where the dilapidated cabin stood. Panic seized him. He had nothing to write with. His eyes darted around frantically, landing on a piece of charred wood from an old fire pit. He found a flat, sun-bleached plank pried loose from the cabin's wall. His hands shaking, he began to scrawl a message in the rough, black charcoal. The words came in a frantic, jagged rush. 6 brothers came. "Bishop. They killed the others. Help me. Caleb." He saw the crawl space, a dark opening in the cabin's crumbling foundation. He crawled to the opening and shoved the plank deep inside, a prayer whispered from a faith he no longer had. Then, hearing the distant rumble of the bishop's truck returning, he scrambled back to the barracks, managed to twist the broken shackle back into a semblance of being closed, and collapsed onto the bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. 2 weeks later, a pair of deer hunters named Frank and Gary took a break at the old cabin. Frank noticed the crawl space. "That's odd," he murmured, pointing. "Looks like something's been shoved in there." Curiosity piqued. He reached into the darkness and pulled out a dirty wooden plank. He wiped it clean and squinted at the black markings. "What in God's name?" Gary came over. They stood in the quiet autumn clearing and read the frantic, desperate words. The blood drained from their faces. This wasn't a prank. They abandoned their hunt and drove straight to the state police. The note landed on the desk of Detective Julian Croft. Croft was a veteran, and the name Bishop connected with a faint, dusty file on the back of his mind. A social worker who wouldn't let it go. He pulled the cold case file for the Washington brothers. 6 vanished boys. A couple named Bishop. Last seen in 1989. The note was his justification. Within hours, Croft was leading a tactical team down the overgrown logging road that led to the coordinates approximated by the hunters. They found the compound silent and seemingly abandoned. It was a catalog of horrors: rotting food, crude tools, and an oppressive feeling of despair. The forensics team, sweeping the area, found the first grave within an hour. Then a second, a third, fourth, and fifth. They were all unmarked, all shallow. "Tear this place apart," Croft ordered, his voice a low growl of fury. They lived here for 11 years. The answer is here. They searched the main cabin and the outbuildings. It was in the grim, Spartan barracks where a young officer, checking the integrity of the floor, noticed one board under a bunk felt loose. He pried it up. Beneath it, nestled in the dark, damp earth, was a plastic-wrapped bundle. It was handed out to Croft. He carefully tore open the layers of plastic. Inside was a thick, water-damaged accounting ledger. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, a stark contrast to the terror it described. "My name is Elijah Washington. I am 16 years old. My brothers are Marcus, David, JJ, Leon, and Caleb. Today we were adopted by Michael and Sarah Bishop. I am afraid." Croft read on, his breath catching in his throat. It was all there. A meticulous 11-year chronicle of abuse, starvation, and murder. The deaths of Leon, Marcus, David, and JJ were described in horrifying, soul-crushing detail. Elijah's journal transformed the investigation from a cold case into a roaring blaze. Croft's first call was to a number he found in the old file. "Is this Maria Vance?" The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "My God," Maria whispered, her voice cracking. "Did you find them?" "I need you to come in, Ms. Vance," Croft said gently. "We found something. We found Elijah's journal." When Maria arrived, he led her to a private room and laid a bound copy of the journal's pages on the table. "He documented everything, Maria," Croft said. "Everything you suspected, and worse. You were right." Maria opened the book, her hands trembling. Tears streamed down her face, tears of vindication and profound, soul-shattering grief. The manhunt for Michael and Sarah Bishop and their lone, living captive, Caleb, was now the #1 priority in the state. The final, critical clue came not from a database, but from the pages of Elijah's journal. Maria, poring over the ledger, was trying to listen to Elijah. Late into the night, she found it. In an entry from the last year, Elijah had transcribed parts of one of Sarah's unhinged sermons. She talked to the final flood, Elijah had written. She says we are the serpents of the old world, and the worthy must be cleansed. She keeps repeating a name. The last baptism will be at Eden's Gate, where the waters will purify the final son. Eden's Gate, Maria whispered, frantically calling Croft. "I have something. A name. Eden's Gate." Croft pulled his team off dead-end leads. A search of defunct organizations hit a match. Eden's Gate was the name of a fringe doomsday cult from the 70s. The property records showed the cult had owned a remote plot bordering the Greenwater Reservoir, a vast, isolated body of water on the other side of the state. And that plot had been sold in 1988 to Michael and Sarah Bishop. It was in a floodplain. "They're going to a floodplain," Croft said, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. And Sarah Bishop talks about a final baptism by water. My God, Caleb isn't their son. He's their final sacrifice. As police converged, they found Michael and Sarah Bishop standing on a rickety wooden dock, a small, terrified Caleb between them. They were eerily calm, their faces alight with serene certainty. Detective Croft took the bullhorn. "Michael, Sarah, it's over. Let the boy go." Michael Bishop smiled. "It is not over, Detective." His voice carried clearly over the water. "It is a transfiguration. We offered these boys a chance at purification. 5 were too weak to accept the gift. You murdered them," Croft's voice boomed back. "We have the graves. We have Elijah's words." At the mention of Elijah's name, a flicker of annoyance crossed Sarah's face. The scribe, his pride was his undoing. She looked down at Caleb. "Only this one remains. He will be baptized. He will be purified with us." It was then Croft and Maria understood. This wasn't a hostage situation. It was a murder-suicide pact. As the bishops began to drag a resisting Caleb toward the edge of the dock, two police snipers, hidden in the tree line, fired their shots. Not at the bishops, but at the rotting wooden posts of the dock just in front of them. The bullets splintered the wood, and the section where they stood collapsed, plunging all three into the frigid water. The shock of the cold water broke their grip on Caleb. Officers swarmed the water, pulling the sputtering, terrified boy to safety. Michael and Sarah Bishop, however, made no attempt to swim. They locked hands, looked at each other with a final, beatific calm, and allowed themselves to sink into the dark, silent depths of the reservoir. Caleb was wrapped in blankets, physically unharmed, but psychologically shattered. He was mute, his eyes wide and vacant. When Maria Vance approached him, he flinched. She stopped, her heart aching. She just sat on the ground near him, a quiet, steady presence. The weeks that followed were a blur. The case of the unchosen sons, as the media dubbed them, led to sweeping reforms in the state's foster care system. Maria Vance became Caleb's legal guardian and his most frequent visitor. She told him stories about his parents, about the vibrant, funny little boys his brothers had been, try to rebuild the past that the bishops had tried to burn to ash. The breakthrough came months later. Maria had brought him a drawing pad. One afternoon, she saw him sketching. He drew six figures, stick-like but distinct. He pointed to the tallest one. Elijah, he whispered, his voice dry, and used rasp. He then pointed to each of the others, naming them softly. Marcus, David, JJ, Leon. Finally, he pointed to the smallest figure. Caleb. He looked up at Maria, his eyes clear for the first time. In them, she saw not just the vast ocean of his loss, but the first, flickering light of a survivor. Maria took his hand, her tears falling freely now, not of grief, but of a profound, tragic purpose. The world had taken everything from him, but it had not taken their names. The reckoning wasn't the bishop's watery grave or the headlines in the paper. It was here, in this quiet room, with this broken boy who was beginning, finally, to remember his own name. Her journey, and his, was far from over. It was a long, dark road ahead, but for the first time, they were not walking it alone.